You know, people always talk about betrayal coming from strangers, but the kind of betrayal that shakes your bones, the kind that scars your soul and makes you question every single thing you ever believed in, comes only from family. That's why I need you to hear this, because what happened to me wasn't just some simple family drama. It was a 15-year saga of exclusion, humiliation, and the cruel kind of silence that eats away at your dignity. Imagine being the youngest in a family that always prided itself on unity, on gathering every summer, on making those big grand reunions where photos would be plastered across social media and cousins would laugh together while uncles and aunts showed off how successful their children had become. But for some reason, you're the only one who never gets an invitation, never gets a phone call, never even gets a courtesy text. At first you convince yourself, maybe they forgot, maybe it was a mistake, maybe your number got lost or they didn't know you were in town. But then year after year goes by and the silence grows louder until it becomes undeniable. They didn't forget you, they purposely cut you out. That's what I lived through for 15 years. 15 years of watching my family live their best moments without me, while I built my life brick by brick, silently, without their support, without their presence, without their applause. And let me tell you, there's nothing that fuels a person like rejection. Every time I saw their smiling faces in group photos I wasn't part of, I worked harder, I studied longer, I pushed myself into opportunities no one believed I deserved. And I climbed so high that by the time they remembered I existed, I was no longer the person they dismissed. I was the man with the mansion on the hill, the man they never thought I could become. So when that knock came on my gate, 15 years after they locked me out of their gatherings, I knew this wasn't just some random visit. I knew this was the test of whether I'd opened the door to the very people who made sure I felt unwanted, or whether I'd finally show them what it felt like to be on the other side of the gate, looking in. And believe me, the way I handled it will make you rethink how far forgiveness should go. Because sometimes closing the door is the sweetest form of closure. I remember that day as if it were carved into my memory with a blade. The air was warm, the sun was sinking into the horizon, painting my estate in shades of gold, and I was sitting in my study overlooking the garden where the fountain I had imported from Italy shimmered under the evening light. Life had become something I once thought was impossible. I had wealth, respect, and peace, but most importantly, I had built it all on my own, without leaning on anyone who had doubted me. Then suddenly, the intercom buzzed, and the security guard's voice came through, telling me a large group of people had shown up at the gate. My first instinct was curiosity, perhaps. It was some business associates, maybe even old friends, but when he said their last name, my blood ran cold. It was them. My family, the same family who had erased me from their lives, who had pretended I didn't exist, who hadn't called me for birthdays, weddings, or even funerals. For a moment, I froze, because in 15 years I had imagined this exact scene in my head 1,000 times. Sometimes in my fantasies I welcomed them with open arms, smiling at their shock when they saw how far I had come. Other times I imagined slamming the gates shut, watching their faces twist in shame. And now, suddenly, it wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was real. They were really there. They had the nerve to show up, uninvited, at my mansion, as if the years of silence could be erased with a knock on the gate. I walked slowly to the door, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor, and with every step I thought of the young version of myself who used to beg for their approval, who used to wonder why he wasn't good enough to sit at their table. That boy was gone now, replaced by someone who had learned the hard way that love from the wrong people is just poison. By the time I reached the front door, my mind was clear. This was not just a family reunion. This was justice served on a silver platter, and for once I held the power. As I opened the door and looked down the long driveway at their familiar faces, all clustered together, shifting uncomfortably under the gaze of my guards, I realized something I had never admitted to myself before. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't bitter. I was ready. Ready to show them what it meant to be ignored for 15 years, and then to finally be the one holding the keys to entry. And the words that came out of my mouth in that moment, the very first words they heard from me in over a decade, set the tone for everything that followed. Because I wasn't there to make peace. I was there to remind them of the choices they had made and the consequences they now had to live with. The moment our eyes met across that long driveway, it was as though time folded back on itself, dragging me through all the years of silence and indifference. But instead of pain, I felt an odd sense of detachment, as if I were watching strangers who had once played roles in my past. Their faces, some older, some grayer, some lined with the weight of time, looked back at me with a strange mix of hesitation and forced smiles. And in that instant I realized they hadn't come here out of love. No, love would have made them reach out 15 years ago. Love would have made them include me when I was desperate for belonging. What I saw in their eyes now wasn't love, it was need. They needed something from me. I could feel it in the way they shifted uncomfortably, in the way they avoided looking directly at the mansion towering behind me, and in the way my cousin, the one who used to mock me for not being good enough, nudged the others forward as though pushing them to make the first move. It was almost laughable, the audacity they carried with them, to erase me for more than a decade and then show up now. When life had crowned me with everything they once flaunted in front of me, I let the silence stretch, just long enough to make them squirm, before I finally broke it with a calm, steady voice. "What are you doing here?" Simple words, but I could see the sting in them, because what I really meant was, why now? Why after all these years? My uncle, the one who used to host the reunions at his big farmhouse, stepped forward first, clearing his throat and putting on that rehearsed tone of authority he always used. He started with flattery, telling me how proud they all were of what I had accomplished, how they had always known I was destined for great things. I almost laughed out loud, because I remembered vividly the way he had once told me I'd never amount to anything, that I was wasting my time chasing dreams instead of sticking to the safe path he laid out for his own children. His words rang in my memory like echoes of a different life, but here he was, rewriting history, pretending they hadn't abandoned me when I needed them most. I didn't respond. I just let him keep talking, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to weave a narrative of love and support, while the others nodded and chimed in with their fake smiles. It was surreal, almost theatrical, and I realized then that the mansion, the wealth, the life I had built, wasn't just a home, it was a mirror reflecting their failures back at them. And while they stood there trying to convince me that this reunion was about family, I could sense the truth lurking beneath their words. They weren't here to reconnect. They were here because they needed something only I could give, and that realization filled me with a quiet kind of power I had never felt before. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the outsider begging to be let in, they were. As I stood there, leaning casually against the grand doorway of my mansion, I let their words tumble out like a poorly rehearsed play. Each sentence carried a weight of desperation wrapped in cheap sentiment, and the longer they spoke, the clearer it became that this was no family reunion, no sudden burst of long-lost affection. This was strategy. They had chosen their words carefully, sprinkling in reminders of childhood memories, talking about how family is everything, and even mentioning how much I had been missed at weddings and birthdays, as though they could erase the fact that not a single one of them had picked up the phone or written to me for a decade and a half. I studied their faces one by one. My aunt, who once told me straight to my face that I was an embarrassment to the family name, now had her eyes lowered, unable to meet my gaze. My cousin, who used to laugh about how I would never get out of the rut, stood there in a cheap suit, sweat lining his forehead as if the weight of his failures was pressing down on him. And even my own brother, the one who had been my closest friend until he chose their approval over me, now looked older, tired, and strangely uncertain of his place among them. They had come as a unit, but I could see the cracks. This wasn't about togetherness. This was about survival. I asked no questions. Not yet. I wanted to see how far they'd go with their charade. And so I let them keep spinning their story, nodding every now and then, as though I were considering their words. Inside, however, I was cataloging every insult, every time they'd turn their backs on me, every empty chair at the table where I should have sat. The mansion behind me wasn't just stone and glass, it was proof, a monument built from the very rejection they had handed me. It stood as a living contradiction to every single word they had used to diminish me. And that's when my uncle finally let the truth slip, almost carelessly, as if he couldn't hold it back anymore. He mentioned a situation, a financial downturn, and in that moment, the carefully painted picture of love and family cracked wide open. Their businesses were failing, their farms, investments, everything they once bragged about, had crumbled. And now, with nowhere else to turn, they had remembered the nephew, the cousin, the son they had once cast out. It was almost poetic. 15 years of exclusion, and now they stood at my gate because they had run out of options. The irony was delicious, but I didn't smile. No, I let the silence stretch again, holding them in that uncomfortable space, where they had to face the truth of why they were really there. And inside me, a storm was brewing, not of anger, not even of bitterness, but of decision. Because now the question wasn't whether I could forgive them. The real question was, did they deserve even a fraction of the life I had built without them? And the more I looked at their pleading faces, the more I knew the answer would not come easily. There's a strange thing that happens when the tables turn. When those who once dismissed you now stand before you hoping for your mercy. You'd think it would be satisfying, that the vindication would feel sweet, but as I watched them shuffle awkwardly on the gravel of my driveway, I felt something deeper, heavier, almost like I was staring at a living reminder of every sleepless night I spent wondering why I wasn't enough. And yet, instead of fury, I felt a calm power, the kind of power that comes when you finally realize you don't need anyone's approval anymore. I leaned against the doorway, arms folded, letting the silence speak louder than words. They under the weight of it, exchanging glances, whispering as though they could strategize their way into my good graces. Finally, my brother stepped forward, his voice softer than I remembered, almost trembling. "We made mistakes," he said, "but you're still family, and family takes care of each other." I could have laughed at the irony 15 years ago. I begged for those exact words, pleaded for someone to say them when they turned their backs on me. But back then, silence was my only answer. And now, when I had everything they could ever want, suddenly they remembered the meaning of family. I asked him, quietly but firmly, where was family when I was working double shifts to pay for school? Where was family when I sat alone in a tiny apartment, eating instant noodles on Christmas Eve while you all feasted together? Where was family when I buried my dreams in hard work because no one believed in me? Each question hit harder than the last, and for a moment, their eyes dropped. Their rehearsed expressions faltered, and the truth spilled across their faces like cracks in glass. They had no answers, because there were none. My aunt tried to speak, her voice breaking as she muttered excuses about misunderstandings, about not knowing how to reach out, but I stopped her with a raised hand. I didn't want apologies anymore, not when they came 15 years too late. What I wanted was acknowledgement of the choices they had made, the cruelty of exclusion, the years I lost to their silence. And standing there, I realized something even more profound. I had already given myself that closure. I had already proven, through every brick of this mansion, through every success I had earned, that I never needed them to define me. The only thing left now was to decide how much of myself I would allow them to take again. And as they looked at me with eyes full of desperation, waiting for me to open the gates of not just my home but my forgiveness, I knew this was the moment that would define the rest of my life, not because of them, but because of the choice I was about to make for myself. I stepped out from the doorway then, letting the heavy oak door close behind me as I walked down the marble steps toward them, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the silence of that long driveway. The guards shifted slightly, their presence a reminder of how far I had come. And I could see my family's eyes flicker between me and the men who now served my security. A silent acknowledgement that the boy they once overlooked had transformed into someone untouchable. As I approached, I could see the years etched into their faces more clearly. Worry lines, gray hairs, the kind of weariness that comes from watching life slip through your fingers. They were no longer the powerful, unshakable figures I once looked up to. They were fragile, desperate, human. And yet, instead of pity, what I felt was clarity. I stopped just a few feet away, close enough for them to feel the weight of my presence, and I asked again, "Why are you here?" This time I didn't want the sugar-coated version. I wanted the truth. My uncle shifted, his voice dropping lower as he finally admitted it. Their businesses had collapsed. Debts had piled up, and the wealth they once flaunted was nothing but a memory. They had lost the farmhouse, the vacation homes, the cars, everything. They had come to me, not because they wanted me back in the family, but because I was their last hope. The words hung in the air, heavy, almost suffocating, and for a long moment none of us spoke. Inside, a part of me that still carried the scars of their rejection wanted to slam the door shut, to let them feel the same loneliness I had felt all those years. But another part of me, the part that had grown wiser with time, recognized the irony of it all. They had taught me what it felt like to be discarded, and now life had brought them to me in the same state. My brother's eyes filled with tears as he stepped closer, whispering, "Please, don't turn us away." His words cracked something in me, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't sympathy, it was the realization that they still saw me as someone who could save them, as if my success was a lifeboat big enough to carry their failures. I let the silence stretch again, feeling the power shift entirely into my hands. For the first time, they were the ones waiting for my decision. They were the ones seeking my approval. And I knew, standing there under the fading light of the evening, that whatever I chose to do next would not just shape their lives, it would redefine mine. Would I become the bigger person and extend a hand to those who had once left me in the cold? Or would I finally close the circle, teaching them the very lesson they had once taught me? The decision sat heavy on my chest, and as their desperate eyes clung to me, I realized the answer had been forming inside me for years, waiting for this very moment to be spoken aloud. I looked at them standing there, a cluster of once faces now dulled by time and defeat. And I realized this was the moment every sleepless night, every lonely holiday, every tear I'd ever shed had been leading up to. For years, I had imagined this confrontation, pictured it in 1,000 different ways, sometimes with anger, sometimes with forgiveness, sometimes with indifference, but reality had a weight to it that no daydream could ever match. I could feel their desperation pressing against me like a tide, waiting to pull me back into the very ocean that had once drowned me. And in that pressure, I finally found the clarity I had been searching for my whole life. I drew in a slow breath and spoke words I never thought I'd hear myself say. You taught me that family was conditional, that love was something that could be withheld if I didn't fit into your picture. For 15 years, I lived without you, and in that time, I discovered something you never understood. I don't need you to survive, and I certainly don't need you to feel whole. I built everything you see here with my own hands, my own sweat, my own determination. You weren't there to celebrate me when I was nothing, so you don't get to stand here and claim me now that I am everything. The words cut through the air like glass shattering, and I could see their faces crumble, their eyes widening with the reality that the door they expected me to open would remain closed. My brother reached for me again, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Please, we have nowhere else to go." But I shook my head, a calm finality in the gesture. "You had somewhere to go," I said softly. "You had each other, you had your pride, you had your reunions. You chose to live them without me, and now you will have to live without me still." I turned then, giving a signal to the guards, and the gates began to close slowly, the iron bars sliding together with a groan that echoed like a sentence being passed. Their voices rose, pleading, calling my name, but I kept walking back toward the mansion, the crunch of gravel beneath, my shoes steady and unyielding. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing after their acceptance, I was walking away from it, and as the gates clanged shut behind me, sealing them out, I felt a peace settle over me that I had never known before. It wasn't revenge, not exactly, it was something purer, something deeper. It was closure. The boy who once stood outside their gatherings, aching for an invitation, was gone forever. In his place stood a man who had learned that sometimes family isn't defined by blood, but by loyalty, by love, by those who stand with you when you have nothing to offer but yourself. And though I walked into that mansion alone, I didn't feel lonely. I felt free. Free from the chains of their approval, free from the scars of their rejection, free from the need to ever look back again. The story didn't end with ended with my decision, my power, my voice, and in that ending, I found my true beginning.